It's a time rich in history, culture and stories. So I wanted to spend some time exploring this fascinating chapter in history by speaking to experts from across the globe.
Please.
We'll navigate the intricate landscapes of power and ambition which you'll be able to explore in Assassin's Creed Shadows, and introduce you to the
100% is reading a script. 100% this is sponsored by Ubisoft. Well, let's say 99%.
the major figures who dominated and defined the era. In this episode, Dr. Chris Harding from the University of Edinburgh will help us understand the warring states of the Sengoku period and the unification of Japan.
Please.
Nate Ledbetter from Princeton University will shed light on arguably the key figure of the whole period, who you'll be able to encounter in the game. And Dr. Kate Kitagawa
Oda Nobunaga
will give me a taste of what it would actually be like to live in medieval Japan, and
She's a lovely, lovely smile.
whether being a samurai was all it's really cracked up to be. Let's dive into the echoes of history.
1467, 1568. Yeah.
Okay, Chris, can you help us to locate Assassin's Creed Shadows in the world? We know we're in Japan, we're in the Sengoku period. What does that mean in terms of when we are? And I guess for a bit of
Very end. I mean, you're really in the tail end of the Sengoku period, almost in the Edo Jidai.
context, can you tell us a bit about what else might be happening in the world that we might be familiar with?
Yes, so this is the 1460s in Japan, running for at least a century into the 1560s, and some historians would give it another few years after that. So at least a century or more of this all against all warfare between some of the different fiefs that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
And for context elsewhere, you've got the Tudors in England, beginning with Henry VII's seizure of the crown in 1485. You've also got, I suppose, almost but not quite midway between England and Japan, India, where from the 1520s you have the rise of the Mughal dynasty, who
I actually like the framing of that the professor is providing now. I think that's pretty nice.
are in power there for a good couple of centuries. So relative dynastic stability in England and India, but pretty much chaos in Japan.
Sounds like an ideal place to set an Assassin's Creed game. And what was feudal medieval Japan like before the upheavals of the Sengoku period? How is Japanese society ordered?
Right.
So for a while, for a few centuries,
Imperial
thinking about maybe
power,
the 600s through to around 1100 or so, Japan is ruled more or less by an emperor based in what we now call Kyoto, alongside an aristocracy who most of whom are based in
Oh, the reason why he's saying what we now call Kyoto is because it was Heian-kyo in period. That was actually Heian-kyo, and the imperial power was the, believe it or not, topic of my dissertation thesis at university when I graduated.
Kyoto and own these vast tracts of land elsewhere. And then across the 1100s, you have the rise of these warrior bands,
Yep.
who initially are just employed by aristocrats as bodyguards in Kyoto, or to look after their concerns out in the countryside. And I think that partly explains why you get the rise of warrior bands who, after a while, don't just work for an aristocrat.
Now, of course, in this case, the editor is showing some footage from the game, but to keep in mind that this is a very late version of a samurai anyways, because of the sort of armor that we see him wearing, which wouldn't have been a thing at the very beginning of samurai history, of course.
Employer, but actually have loyalty to one another within their group. So this concept of vassals starts to develop. This gets to the point actually from the 1100s, the late 1100s onwards, where Japan is ruled de facto by warrior governments, what we would
Right.
call shogunates.
Yeah.
The Kamakura shogunate from the late 12th century through to the early 14th, and then the Ashikaga shogunate after that. So just before this era of chaos breaks out, Japan has had a few centuries of warrior rule.
During those shogunates, does the position of the emperor still exist? Is he still there? Or
Yeah, it's more of a formal figure. I mean, once you have the shogunate and the shogun in power in Edo, by the way, so modern day Tokyo, that's the de facto rule. That's what the power is, and the emperor is mostly a puppet at this point.
or is he pushed
Rich
aside
puppet.
completely during those periods?
So the emperor is always there in Kyoto.
Yep.
The notion of a shogun, it means something like barbarian crushing generalissimo. So there in the title is the fact that this individual officially works for the emperor. His role is to go out there and crush the emperor's enemies. But in fact, it's the shoguns who organize taxes, the shoguns who says who gets which pieces of land.
Exactly. So if the emperor was like, I don't like that, the shogun would completely ignore that. Like, they wouldn't even say it at this point.
Shoguns who issue these legal codes and oversee a system of judgment. So in every meaningful way, the shoguns are in charge.
And so
Absolutely correct, yes. Great, good professor. Finally, you'd be like, but of course he's a good professor. And people are like, of course, if he's a professor. No. On this channel, we've seen it. Professors pushing complete, utter nonsense. So I'm happy that that's not the case up to this point.
That's the role and the position of a shogun. Essentially, he's the head of government. Just
General.
Thinking of another couple of words that might crop
Head
up.
of government, but is also a military guy. It's kind of close to the magistrates in ancient Rome. In fact, if you think about it, they were both magistrates in the legal sense, in the bureaucratic sense, but they were also general military leaders, particularly in the early stages of magistrates in ancient Rome. So yeah, it's actually kind of similar to that. Involvement of the bureaucratic aristocrats and the government figures into the military, kind of fusing together.
But when we think about medieval Japan, what is a samurai? I mean, samurai has got to be a word that everybody knows, but what does it really mean?
So it's going to go with the servant original meaning, I suppose.
So it comes from the verb
Saburao.
meaning to serve. So initially the ethos was that these people were trained bodyguards, so they might stand outside the door of a particularly high-strung aristocrat. And it's the sense of being, I think, a professional warrior on that basis and passing on those skills to the next generation. The key change that I think happens across the 1100s is that the object of loyalty for the samurai changes from being the employer who pays them to actually being a senior member of their band, maybe related by blood. And you start to have these hierarchies within the samurai. That really is the focus of their loyalty, of their entire ethos. So the whole samurai culture that develops is quite divorced from this idea of basically a paid bodyguard, which is how they begin. In the aftermath of the Sengoku period, once Japan enters this period of settled fiefdoms, which are almost completely independent, the fact that the top samurai in each fief, called the daimyo, is more or less an autocratic ruler with nothing to do with anybody else outside his fiefdom. The samurai
great landowner, great names. It's a way to translate it a bit more literally.
Structure underneath him, I think, comes to matter all the more. So I think there's that shift all the way through, and it probably reaches its height in the period just after the Sengoku era, I would say.
I think it's one of those things we tend to view it as quite a static thing. We think a samurai is a thing, but a samurai is actually a concept, an idea that evolves and changes. Another word...
Absolutely, and also there are lots of different words to describe. You have the word bushi, which is kind of more of a general umbrella term. In other words, all samurai are bushi, but not all bushi are samurai. It's one way to look at it, because bushi can include warriors and professional, in fact, warriors or half-professional warriors that are bushi, but they're not samurai in the sense of the title. So that's when it starts getting closer to the idea of, for instance, the distinction between a knight in medieval Europe and a professional man-at-arms. Professional men-at-arms who fight in the manner of the knight sometimes are absolutely indistinguishable in iconography from a medieval knight when it comes to if they are successful and they're wealthy and they're well trained. Yeah, they basically look like knights. So the only difference between a professional man-at-arms at that point, even who fight again mounted, and a knight, is that a knight is titled, so they're mounted nobility. And that's similar, I want to say, here. So samurai do have several, but they're not identical from a structural standpoint within Japanese society when you compare to feudal Japan, feudal Europe. But there are some points of connections between the medieval knight and the samurai.
That you mentioned there, daimyo. Can we get a bit of an idea of what the daimyo was and what he did?
Yeah.
Yes. So when the old shogunates were working properly, I was saying a moment ago, you've got the Kamakura shogunate, then you've got the Ashikaga shogunate after that. These are two different shogunates with two different families controlling them. One follows on from the other. In theory, in that system, the way they control the rest of Japan is they send out what are called shugo, these warrior constables, you could call them. So people in their employ, they'll send them out to these provinces and they'll say, you look after law and order for us out there, make sure you hold on to this province. If we need to raise troops out there, you can take care of that. those sorts of roles for the Shugo, who may, when they initially went out to that part of Japan, have had no family connection at all. But what happens, I think, during the Sengoku period is that some of these warrior constables, they actually put down roots in these areas. They make alliances, they perhaps marry, they come to have much more autonomy and control over what goes on within that territory than they initially did when they were parachuted